wonderful turnout, and I'm excited that you're here, and I'm especially excited that Dr. Fred Hoffman is here. We've been kind of talking about this for a few years, and it's great when it finally happens, and I get to meet Winter as well, so come up and say hello. But through our Masterworks on Loan program, we have had a steady stream of Basquiat paintings, and we have a little one now that's in the Gilkey. If you haven't seen it, at some point you can. So we keep thinking, can we even time this sometime when Fred can talk and we can have the work on view so you can go and check it out yourself. But we have some great images, and even some of them are of works that we've had on view here, which is unusual and wonderful. So I'm going to give you a short bio, and then Fred will give us a lecture, and then we'll have some time for questions after that, right? So, as I said, we are thrilled to have Fred Hoffman here, who is perhaps the foremost expert on Jean-Michel Basquiat in the world, really. He's devoted considerable time to this artist. Fred worked closely with Basquiat from 1982 to 1984, when the artist was living and working in Venice, California. During that time, he produced most of the artist's limited edition silkscreen prints. And we are fortunate that Fred and Winter have donated a portfolio, which some students here, I think, saw earlier today. In 2005-06, Fred co-curated the artist's last American retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum, which also traveled to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles and the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. Fred has served as a member of the Authentication Committee for the estate of Basquiat. He did that for several years and had some interesting stories already on that. And in 2014, he published the book, Jean-Michel Basquiat Drawing, in conjunction with the exhibition of the same name that was at Acquavella Gallery in New York. In 2017, he published The Art of Jean-Michel Basquiat. But Fred has also had a life as a gallerist in the 1980s and 90s. He organized major exhibitions with such artists as Basquiat, but also Chris Burden, Robert Rauschenberg, Tom Wesselmann, Cindy Sherman, Jenny Holzer, Barbara Kruger, and really so many others. He received his doctorate in 1976 from UCLA. He is the author of several publications in addition to ones I've already mentioned, including the major monograph Catalogue Raisonné on Chris Burden. And others include Keith Haring, The Birth of Wonder, Thoughts on the Return and Artistic Maturation of Dennis Hopper, and The Art of Don Van Vliet. He also produced 2 early books with Mike Calle. And that's really just scratching the surface. So if you want to know more, you can access his website at fredhoffmanfineart.com. So Fred, we are honored that you are here today, and please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As Jill said, I've had a wonderful association with your museum, and it just seems fitting to finally come up here and to talk to you on something that is obviously close to my heart and that I've devoted a lot of time to. Let's see here. Shortly after Jean-Michel Basquiat took up residency at Larry Gagosian's Venice Beach townhouse in November 1982, for the purpose of preparing his second exhibition in Los Angeles, Larry contacted me on behalf of Jean-Michel, asking if I would meet with the artist to discuss the production of a silkscreen project the artist wanted to produce. I met with Jean-Michel in his new Venice studio in November 1982, at which time we began work on Tuxedo, depicted here on the left, an ambitious 8 by 5 foot silkscreen on canvas, which would be the first of 6 silkscreen editions I produced with him. I regularly visited Basquiat in his Venice studio. Well, and the photographs on the right, I found actually like 3 weeks ago. This is the first time they've actually been seen by anybody other than myself and the person who took them. And they show a series of photographs of Basquiat in his Venice studio with his studio assistant, a fellow named Matt Dyke. I regularly visited Basquiat in his Venice studio. While my primary purpose was to work with him on the silkscreen projects, I was equally drawn to watching him at work. The studio was essentially a gallery space Larry Gagosian had built as the ground floor of his new home on Market Street in Venice. It was about 1,500 square feet with 10-foot-high ceiling and 4 clean white walls. In the middle were a few rolling tables covered with paints, brushes, oil paint sticks, pencils, drawings, color photocopies, magazines, books, and newspapers. These tables soon became cluttered with a vast array of various working materials, all of which the artist would use to make his paintings. In one corner, and you can see it depicted in the lower right image, there was a mattress on the floor. Next to it, a boombox and piles of CDs. This was the one place in the studio where I could hang out, removed, able to observe, even talk to Jean-Michel, and at the same time, stay out of his way. Basquiat often got to work in the early afternoon, then worked late into the night. On the walls were paintings in various states of completion, some with only a move or two, others labored over with multiple layers of paint, imagery, text, collage drawings, and photocopies. There was no one way he developed a canvas. Some started with the application of abstract passages of paint, others with an image or collaged text drawing. In most cases, Basquiat would lay down a body of content and then obliterate a good portion of it, leaving only a fragment of the original. Whatever approach he chose, Basquiat worked at a breakneck pace, constantly in motion, going from paint, images, and text on one canvas to starting another. Watching Jean-Michel Basquiat at work was one of my greatest experiences in the art world. His strategies, intuition, fluidity, and talent were unique for his time. During my time with Jean-Michel Basquiat in Venice from 1982 to 84, he often confided with me about his creative expression as well as his career. It was therefore appropriate when British curator Mark Francis reached out to me in late 1983 to put him in contact with the artist to present his work at the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh. This would become Jean-Michel Basquiat's first museum exhibition. Prior to this, Basquiat's work had been presented in various one-person exhibitions in galleries in New York, Los Angeles, Zurich, Rotterdam, Tokyo, Modena, Italy, and inclusion in the key international group exhibition, the Documenta 7 in Kassel. When it came to making selections for his first survey of his work by a major cultural institution, Basquiat focused primarily on work he had kept for himself, as well as some acquired by the astute young collectors Herb and Lenore Shore, with whom he had developed a close friendship. Of the 16 works included in this exhibition, 8 were from his own. This is one of the ones from Basquiat's own collection, which is still in the estate of the artist. 4 were from the Shores. This is one example of a painting from the Shore collection. 4 were from others, including one from Andy Warhol. This actually on the left was owned by Andy Warhol at the time. The work on the right was from Basquiat's own collection, and this one other painting. With one exception, those are just a selection. With one exception, all of the works from Jean-Michel Basquiat's collection remained in his possession during his lifetime, and many are still owned by the artist's estate. While most included in the Fruit Market Gallery exhibition were also included in the major museum surveys presented after his death. In fact, I exhibited all of these works in the Brooklyn MoCA exhibition in 2005. One remained in the collection of his estate, but it fell into relative obscurity. From the time of its initial exhibition in 1984 at the Fruit Market Gallery until it was sold by the estate at Sotheby's in New York in 2015, Masonic Lodge was almost completely overlooked. Parenthetically, after it was acquired by its current owner, it went on exhibition here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. In fact, this is the only place it's been seen other than at Sotheby's since 1984. The overriding subject of Masonic Lodge is the anatomy of the human head, primarily to major structural parts. Texts in the painting include frontal bone, crown, temporal, ramus, parietal bone, jaw, hinge, chin box, occipital. Throughout Basquiat's career, he was drawn to images of the human anatomy. During his hospitalization at the age of 8, after having been hit by an automobile, his mother brought to him at the hospital a copy of Gray's Anatomy, where he started drawing, actually at the age of 8. His interest in anatomy is best evidenced by the numerous works he produced, which refer to Leonardo da Vinci's studies of human anatomy, including Leonardo's greatest hits, depicted here on the left, an academic study of the male torso, which is actually one of the silkscreens I produced with him. And these are two of countless examples of works that reference Leonardo da Vinci. In Masonic Lodge, Basquiat chose to depict aspects of the skull from above and from different sides. These parts and partial views and texts are not presented with a concern for accurate placement, but more as fractured or broken apart, yet linked together by their shared representation in a white or yellow line set against the luminescent purple-blue background. Basquiat's references, go ahead one. Basquiat's reference to parts of the human head are both to its internal and exterior structure. Sometimes he includes portions of human physiognomy, notably the rendering of an ear, the fairly complete portrayal of the lower jaw, the words bulge of teeth, and the only fully illustrative image in the painting, an eye. You can see that here. Some of the artist's anatomical references are more schematic, such as the diagram of the top of the head in the lower left section of the painting. Basquiat's depiction of the human head is not realistic. He portrays it from different aspects, a jaw facing left, an ear facing right. Taken together, the various parts constitute a head facing 3/4 to the left, while the eye in the center stares straight out towards the viewer, a simultaneous representation of two very different views. This is a pictorial strategy Basquiat had begun to explore some 18 months before the execution of Masonic Lodge, first in a black oil stick work on paper depicted here. This is from early 1981. This work is one of Basquiat's most intense forays into the reductive language of Picasso. This entirely line-drawn work also suggests the artist's inspiration from sub-Saharan African sculpture, and I brought in one of several examples that would make the point. The work's specific focus on both Picasso and sub-Saharan African sculpture separates it from the other head images produced at this time. Basquiat's black and white drawing presents many views of a single head. While both eyes and mouth are frontal, the cranium is viewed from the side. In this work, Basquiat's concern is the simultaneous depiction of exterior and interior realms. While the drawing portrays the projecting facial features of eyes, nose, and mouth, it also has a much less obvious interior dimension. With the execution of this work, Basquiat would come to realize that cohesiveness could give way to a true disassembling of disparate but related parts. Masonic Lodge, executed 18 months after Basquiat's earlier black and white head study, represents the culmination of his interest in a fracturing of related parts of the same form of the human head. He pushed the limits in Masonic Lodge, challenging himself to present an integrated subject with a minimum of structural integrity. More elusive are the two partially circular lines at the top center of the painting, whose anatomical references only become clear from the text adjacent to them, frontal bone, parietal bone. The linear form directly above this descriptive phrase is the artist's rendering of the forehead. The line next to to the text parietal bone is Basquiat's rendering of the bone that forms the central side and upper back part of the skull. These two curvilinear forms, you can see them here in the detail, forms thereby bring to mind the shape of the top of the skull, especially as viewed from the side. Reinforcing his depiction of a bifurcated skull, Basquiat drew a white line running down from top to bottom, dividing the picture in half. Perhaps Basquiat meant to represent the spinal column and the pathway by which sensory stimuli are conveyed to the brain. Basquiat's interest in this is in numerous works, possibly best evidenced in Back of the Neck, which not only shows the artist's continued fascination with human anatomy and physiology, but also how perception, cognition, and extension consciousness become possible. I would suggest here that the crown would be a symbol alluding to human consciousness. While Basquiat's bifurcation of his canvas served his intent to distinguish two halves of the human skull, I would propose that it also served his interest in alluding to two realms of consciousness. Basquiat continually sought to portray a duality informing phenomenal experience, whether it was the representation of the scales of justice, the juxtaposition of the words God and law, or the painting of the same title with the text flesh and spirit depicted on the right. Throughout Basquiat's short career, he remained fascinated by this concept and theme. And this monumental canvas on the right, Flesh and Spirit, you can see repetition of the references to these two realms. In many ways, Masonic Lodge came to represent for Basquiat a new Rosetta Stone, an even more abstract means of capturing the duality of flesh and spirit. In retrospect, this would be another reason that the artist felt compelled to create the work and retain it throughout his life. A slight digression here. More or less overlooked in the literature on the Venetian master Titian is the portrait of Archbishop Filippo Arquinto housed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, seen here on the right. Titian shows Arquinto in a chair from a three-quarter angle, the so-called seated bishop position found in several mid-16th century Italian Renaissance portraits. What distinguishes this obscure work is the depiction of a filmy curtain dividing the figure in half, running from the top of the canvas 2/3 of the way down to the bottom. Titian's veil defines and at the same time obscures the figure being portrayed. The literature is scant on both this work and this particular archbishop. I would propose that Titian turn to this device not to tell us something specific or unusual about his subject, but rather to allude to two realms of consciousness, or two realities, which together define not only his figure, but all of mankind. As this highly unusual work declares, that which is clear and visible relates to an external reality. That which is obscured by the mysterious curtain suggests an internal realm. Jumping forward 450 years, Basquiat, fully versed in modernist history and practice, presents the same duality through a simple vertical linear element. Completing this summary review of the most immediately recognizable text images in Masonic Lodge, and we will shortly turn to the less apparent, even hidden text images in the underpainting, Basquiat wrote and then painted over the words paranoid schizophrenia, enclosed within a rectangle in the upper left of the painting. While partially obliterated, this declarative text, positioned as if it was the title of the work, is a reminder that Basquiat's choice of subject matter is much more than a visual characterization of anatomical parts. In contrast to other works in which Basquiat drew from his fascination with the anatomical studies of Leonardo da Vinci, here the young artist has not turned to any specific historical or scientific source. Unconcerned with an accurate portrayal and not alluding to any one source, Basquiat was free to create a different kind of schema, the portrayal of the fractured parts of a human head, both external and internal, loosely held together by a linear form. You can see that in the detail on the right, a linear form with no reference to human anatomical part. It begins with a small circle. You can see just where the central line is. It begins with a small circle, continuing as a looping line running along the horizontal axis of the work, and ends in an arrow after passing by the eye. Like the orbital path of a planet around another, Basquiat's line revolves around the human eye, the only fully realized image in the painting. Basquiat's celestial reference circles a vortex or central source. This configuration does not, however, reference planetary movement. Rather, it became a new means for the artist to bring together related parts, suggesting that their unification heralds an awakening of consciousness. Movement is a subtle and significant element in Basquiat's work. Whether it be the implied movement of the artist's expressive gestural paint application or the directionality of clearly recognizable symbols, in Basquiat's work, the viewer is primarily led from bottom to top. Two of Basquiat's most obvious suggestions of movement are his use of arrows and ladders. The ladder image is repeated in both Tuxedo, which we saw at the beginning, and Pegasus. And here we see Pegasus, the full image of Pegasus on the left, one of his great last paintings, and in the detail on the right where you can clearly see one of the ladders. An upward pointing arrow is found in countless works on paper. A wonderful example is Ascent, one of the 32 works from the well-known Darros collection in Zurich, Switzerland, where Basquiat's image of an upward pointing arrow is accompanied by the word ascent, making it clear that the image implies not merely physical movement, but psycho-spiritual transformation. Movement in a circular trajectory, as found in Masonic Lodge, is rare in Basquiat's work, found in only a handful of paintings, and in each case suggestive of a transformative experience. Turning now to a few comments on Basquiat's execution of Masonic Lodge. Excuse me. Along the left side edge of Masonic Lodge, there are letters painted in black on the raw, unprimed canvas. You can see them in both of the images, both details. From top to bottom, we see H, E, E, T, T, R, and N. These letters indicate that prior to the stretching and priming of the canvas, Basquiat had begun to work on what would eventually become a picture. In all likelihood, these letters were the beginning of words that continued on to what became the front of the stretched canvas. Basquiat could begin a work in a variety of ways. In this particular work, it appears that the artist's means of getting into the work was to execute a series of markings on an unstretched piece of canvas, probably while it was lying on the floor of his studio. While the letters on the left side of the canvas picture support do not seem to be part of the painting, they provide insight into an important aspect of the artist's working process, especially in this particular painting. At first, the viewer is drawn to the text, words, diagrams, and anatomical images all on the surface. On second glance, you notice there is texture and information underneath. And in this side view, you can start to get an inkling of that there's more than just immediately meets the eye. Some of the earlier text imagery is apparent from frontal viewing, a good deal more when viewed from the side. After priming his canvas with white gesso, Basquiat applied a coat of saturated luminescent purple-blue paint, on top of which he drew text and images, some of which are still visible upon careful inspection, especially as viewed from the acute side angle. After filling up portions of his picture surface with words, short phrases, and images, the artist covered them with a layer of thinned down purple-blue paint. In some areas, the earlier application of the more luminescent blue paint shows through the top layer. It creates the effect of a glowing veil underlying the top layer. Caught between layers of paint that function as foreground and background are Basquiat's array of partially visible text and images. One example, directly above the partially recognizable phrase paranoid schizophrenia, the artist has depicted the top of a number of dome structures. You can see them, they're actually below the word paranoid schizophrenia. Dome structures, possibly sacred places of worship. Now keep in mind that's all in this underpainting that you become aware of as the more you look at the painting. The underpainting in Masonic Lodge plays a significant role in the overall resolution of the work's subject matter and meaning. Some of this underpainting is visible, while other parts are only evident from ultraviolet lighting and captured through photography. And I had the good fortune to work with the owner of the painting, and we did extensive photography of the painting, which isn't often the case. The dialogue between the work's underpainting and its topmost layer of paint application is one of the defining features of the work, making Masonic Lodge one of the artist's most complex usages of this pictorial technique. Buried in a layer of paint below the schematic outline of the head and the text horseshoe of jaw, in the lower right, Basquiat wrote the words, you can see it here on the left, sickles, mattocks, forks, axes. None of these words seem to directly relate to the artist's various depictions of the human skull. Also embedded in the underpainting in the same area are the words frontal, head, and below big eyes, tying this phase of the painting's execution to what Basquiat depicted in the final paint surface. Also embedded in this area is the name Leonardo da Vinci. Actually, we'll see the the name Leonardo in a subsequent image. While none of the recognizable head imagery in Masonic Lodge can be traced to Leonardo's own anatomical head studies, Basquiat always had the Renaissance master in mind when focusing on the subject of human anatomy. Another fascinating, well, here on the right now you can see Leonardo da Vinci. Another fascinating set of jumping ahead, a little out of order here. Another fascinating set of images in the underlayer of paint is a number of ghost-like heads. And you can see one of the ghost-like heads in the right image. And they actually are scattered all over the underpainting. These heads functions as voices from another, less tangible realm or time, in communication with the more visible layers of content in the work. It is for this reason that they are described as ghost-like. They do not feel part of our lived experience, and their presence is hidden from our view. While they have an undefined, haunting relationship with the work's subject matter, they become an important sub-theme in our understanding of the work. Finally, in careful viewing from a side angle, the viewer can make out the words Masonic Lodge. And you can see the words Masonic Lodge right across the center there. And then on the slide on the right, you can see the words Leonardo da Vinci at the top. While this assortment of text and images is only partially visible, the artist clearly intended that they be assimilated with the more readily viewable imagery and text in the final layer of paint. Delving into the layers of paint, imagery, words, and text contained within this painting provides insight into Basquiat's working procedure. It reveals an artist with the confidence to experiment as he undertook the execution of a work of art, and the insight that certain subjects could best be captured by a spontaneous approach. Basquiat rarely trusted or felt comfortable trying to achieve a final result from one set of actions. Instinctively, he knew that however he started a painting, it would, in all likelihood, trigger new and possibly unexpected responses, which in turn would lead to additional layers of paint and imagery. As a careful reading of Masonic Lodge makes apparent, an initial set of actions created the context for an even more insightful exploration of the subjects and themes of the painting. And just as the final painting was the result of a building up of multiple layers of information, so too is the process by which we decode this particular painting. The media frenzy surrounding the May 18, 2017 sale at Sotheby's, New York, of Untitled Head by Jean-Michel Basquiat for $110.5 million to newly anointed mega collector Yusaku Maezawa has somewhat obscured the focus not only on this particular artwork, but also on Basquiat's subjects and themes as he reached artistic maturity in late 1981 and early 1982. The media and subsequently the public have been consumed with a history-making price, and the focus has shifted away from artistic intent and the relationship of this particular work to other works produced by the young Basquiat. In fact, the subject of this work, a large expressive head executed with a bravura performance of both brushwork and color, was the subject of other paintings and works on paper executed between 1981 and 1983. Between 1981 and 1983, Jean-Michel Basquiat produced many of his most compelling and challenging works in which the subject matter is the human head. This is one of the more, I think, more profound examples called Two Heads on Gold. In some paintings, it's a single head. In others, a group, and all are representational. Many of Basquiat's head studies have been interpreted as masked figures rather than recognizable beings. This conclusion stems from the somewhat generalized way in which the facial features have been rendered. As previously discussed, in a few of these works evidence the artist's initial foray into the abstracting language of Picasso, Cubism, and sub-Saharan African and oceanic art. Even in this particular groups, the head is more often lifelike than not. When the subject matter was representational, Basquiat was drawn as much to what existed underneath the features as he was to the surface. This is surely what motivated him to undertake what I shall refer to as the Maezawa head. This seminal work shows the artist's fascination with the face as a passageway via the eyes and the mouth into the hidden realms of the emotive life, the character's psychology. The eyes see out and invite the viewer in. The mouth expresses words and thoughts and draws energy in. While this head hardly appears to represent a real person with individualized expression and articulated emotive content, it displays basic human attributes of passion and expression. It is noteworthy that at the time of his death, in addition to Masonic Lodge, Basquiat possessed no fewer than 27 head studies executed in 1982. We know this to be true because 27 works on paper, each depicting a unique head image, were presented in the seminal Basquiat Drawing exhibition at the Robert Miller Gallery in November 1990 in New York City. All of the works included in this exhibition came from the estate of the artist. In the exhibition, these works were all presented on one wall and are a portrait gallery of personages in a diverse array of psychological states. They are a key link to the artist's development of his singular voice and visual language. Basquiat kept this group of works for a couple of different reasons. In a few instances, a specific drawing was subsequently photocopied and collaged onto a later painting. That Basquiat kept a great number of the early 82 head drawings can at least partially be explained by the fact that in 1982, most early collectors of Basquiat primarily wanted to buy his canvases. More importantly, it reflects his desire, and possibly even his need, to stay close to his sources, to maintain a connection with the psychological environment from which he constantly drew his artistic energy and motivation. While it remains unclear whether any of the highly expressive head images from this formative moment depict a specific individual, each resulted from the artist reflecting on or contemplating a specific experience, whether external or internal. Basquiat thought of his diverse head studies as a portrait gallery. This seems obvious in the multi-panel paintings silkscreen, depicted here, and Mitchell Crew, the former executed at the same time as the head drawings shown previously, the latter following only a few months later. In silkscreen, there are 6 heads, each fully frontal, eyes and mouth wide open, gazing directly out at the viewer. While none of the heads in this work can easily be identified as a portrait of a specific person, each figure's hair and skin coloration is different, giving the impression that they represent the artist's crew. With a radiant nimbus above each head, these souls are made eternal, existing in memory as they once were as functioning beings. The idea of presenting an array of characters as the subject of a painting is played out again in Mitchell Crew, where Basquiat transforms his interest in individual head studies into a complete portrait gallery. In this major multi-panel masterwork, the artist now presents 9 distinct heads, many sharing facial features with the earlier head studies. As the phrase repeated 2 times in the work states, the Mitchell Crew are part of the Artist's Hall of Fame. Basquiat's most important achievement of this type is Philistines. The work presents 3 frontally placed figures, 2 of which are rendered as head and half torso, the third simply as head and neck. Harking back to the earlier head motifs, the eyes are over life-size, seeming to bulge out of their sockets. The mouths also appear unnaturally large, open and bearing teeth. Basquiat bestows on these figures the same dual function of outward focus and internal penetration that he earlier explored in his head studies. The eyes of the figures almost appear to hunt us down, not allowing escape from their psychic hold on the viewer. The psychological presence of these figures pushes out towards the realm of the viewer. At the same time, these open orifices invite the viewer to peer into the figure's internal life. This duality is also asserted in the rendering of the 2 half-torsos. In the central figure, the chest cavity is opened up, exposing both ribs and spine. The viewer is made privy to the figure's central channel of energy. In Masonic Lodge, this same central channel has been reduced to a continuous white line. That Basquiat desired to establish a more direct relationship between these figures and the viewer is further supported by the artist's expressive paint application. Permeating the physicality of his figures, his vibrant brushstrokes unify the figure and ground, pushing the figures forward into the realm of the viewer. Who are the Philistines? Basquiat presents them as formidable foes. They are smug, possibly indifferent, somewhat antagonistic. He presents them as a strong, authoritative force, which must be reckoned with. While these figures are confrontational, even a bit scary, the energy that they exude is irresistible. It is an experience we want to be part of. Basquiat is not concerned with physical forces of power and destruction as much as he desires to draw attention to those psychological forces that tear into oneself, possibly revealing a truer or fuller being. Basquiat was also focused on a more conceptual treatment of the human head. As Basquiat began his pictorial career, he understood that he had the insight into a deeper aspect of human experience, and that he could also create visual equivalents of an eternal life through the image of the human head. While his focus remained on observation and representation, he also sought to portray the recognition of self. Basquiat saw the depiction of the human head as a vehicle for presenting the process by which one becomes aware of one's identity. The most compelling of the conceptually driven head images is Untitled, depicted here in the Broad collection in Los Angeles, and what I shall refer to as the Broad head. Other important examples are La Columba, depicted here, and Masonic Lodge. While Basquiat executed hundreds of portraits, there is only a handful of images in which the portrayal of consciousness is the work's underlying subject matter. Sometime in the early months of 1981, a full 18 months prior to painting the Maezawa head, Basquiat began a painting of an oversized head extending across the pictorial field, an image that had no precedent in earlier sketches, drawings, or paintings. Showing little regard for either physiognomic accuracy or individual likeness, Basquiat chose to counter the expressive qualities of his head image with aspects of an internalized state of being. With its public presentation, this painting declared Basquiat's arrival as a new and authentic voice in the world of contemporary art. Parenthetically, Basquiat painted this painting when he was 20 years old. Unlike many of his later paintings, which were completed quickly, the Broad head was begun and put aside for several months to be finished later in the year. One can only speculate about the reasons for his hesitation, but several individuals close to the artist, including myself and Anina Noze, the artist dealer at the time, suspect that the young, unseasoned artist hesitated to complete the work because he was caught off guard, possibly even frightened by the power and energy emanating from this unexpected image. While the painting was presented in the artist's debut exhibition in New York as Untitled, when it entered the collection of its current owners a few months later, the word skull had been appended to the designation Untitled and accompanied the painting through numerous exhibitions for almost 30 years. This renaming was a misinterpretation of the work that may be attributable to the uniqueness of its subject matter. Most likely, the change in title was the result of confusing the work with the more traditional iconography of the memento mori, in which a skull implies death. However, Basquiat's head, having little, if any, precedent in modern art history, requires more careful analysis. Close inspection reveals that this head, unlike a skull, is alive and responsive to external stimuli. As such, it seems alert to our world, while simultaneously allowing us to penetrate its psycho-spiritual recesses. Basquiat's representation of a single enlarged head is a breakthrough. The visual information it contains provides insight into many of the strategies of dichotomy the artist would adopt over the following 18 months. The Broad head depicts the left upper and lower teeth, possibly accounting for the work's misinterpretation as a skull by some. But it clearly also shows functional features as well, the left ear, both eyes, and the nose. There is even the suggestion of hair. While the handling of these features could hardly be characterized as realistic, neither are they grossly distorted or misrepresented. Rather, the way they are portrayed clarifies the artist's intent in depicting a vitally interactive being fully in possession of the means to process external stimuli. That is, the artist also reveals the subtle neural pathways connecting the sense organs to their internal processor. This concern for sensory and cognitive activity negates the interpretation of the head as an inanimate skull. What this work ultimately captures is the fluidity between external and internal, the complex living processes connecting seeing, hearing, smelling, and knowing. The broad head indicates that from the outset, Basquiat was fascinated by greater realities than meet the eye. This work introduces the unique X-ray-like vision he brought to his subjects. His work appears to break down the dichotomy between the external and the internal, and thereby revealing aspects of the psychic life. In so doing, the artist extends the interest in spiritual truths, advanced most notably by the abstract expressionists 4 decades earlier. Artists such as Mark Rothko, Clifford Still, Jackson Pollock, and Barnett Newman attempted to represent a world beyond that which is identified solely with physical experience. Though Basquiat came from a completely different social milieu and historical context, he was equally engaged in the pursuit of fundamental truths. However, he did not achieve this through abstraction, but through newly discovered possibilities for representation. As he pursued his creative activities, the young painter recognized that his breakthroughs would occur in direct relationship to his ability to penetrate intuitively the facade of physical form and appearance and allow other truths and realities to surface. One might ask why Basquiat undertook the Maezawa head after being so mystified by the broad head that he was only able to complete it at the end of 1981 after putting it aside for a number of months. I suggest that Basquiat knew that the subject he was able to realize in the earlier work was such an outlier that he wanted to show himself that he was capable of producing a different type of expressive head. Structurally, the two works share a number of features. Both present a single head image against a similar background of powder blue covering a significant portion of the background. The earlier head occupies a larger space. The latter work relies much more on the overpainting of thick black lines to drive its emotive content. There is subtle articulation of internal parts of the head, the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and brain in the first work. As Basquiat worked his way through the second work, he recognized that he was able to execute a powerful yet significantly different type of painting, primarily addressing emotive content, less an expression of the dialogue between external perception and internal cognition. With the completion of the Maezawa head, Basquiat successfully completed the counterpoint to the earlier undertaking. Far less conceptual, the latter head is part of the lineage of expressive heads from the artist's studio production in 1982. Basquiat did not, however, abandon the exploration of the conceptual implications of his initial head painting. With the execution of Masonic Lodge several months later, Basquiat again turns to the head image as his means of exploring the polarity of external and internal realms of experience. Masonic Lodge is the most fleeting head image in Basquiat's oeuvre. At first glance, one might not even recognize it as a human head. It is a work that could only have been created after the outpouring of more recognizable, less abstracted head images. With the numerous portraits and self-portraits as a background and having undertaken more conceptual head imagery focusing on the subject of consciousness, Basquiat attempted something even less structured and predictable. Masonic Lodge did not have the same appeal to his audience as his other head images. Even though Basquiat struggled with the broad head, requiring him to return to the work over many months before completion, the work quickly left his studio when finished, as did Basquiat's second head, the Maezawa head. Because both works were quickly claimed by collectors, Basquiat knew that he needed to keep something that expressed the energies and vision of his earlier head paintings. He recognized the importance of having a work referencing his breakthrough achievement of simultaneously capturing aspects of an external physical existence and the equally apparent reality of the soul. It was for this reason that he undertook Masonic Lodge, a work presenting a new articulation on the subject of identity. The resulting image must have been seen as an outlier because none of Basquiat's dealers or collectors made any attempt to acquire it. It remained for the artist alone to understand its place in his artistic evolution. The head portrayed in Masonic Lodge is hardly a recognizable illustration, an image conforming to how we physically see ourselves. This is a head which has been taken apart, that has been fractured in order to facilitate different kinds of conclusions. This is a head that invites, even welcomes the viewer to enter into its interior, yet at the same time challenges us, suggesting that there is more than meets the eye. Metaphorically suggesting getting inside someone's head, it equally suggests the more elusive process of recognizing a deeper sense of self. Basquiat did not follow any belief system, spiritual practice, or tradition. But in his titling of a painting, Masonic Lodge, he suggested that the inward quest is as real and meaningful as our outward experience. While there is no documentation that Jean-Michel Basquiat was in any way familiar with the ideas or foundational beliefs of the Freemasons, Masonic Lodge suggests a kindred spirit with the Masons' original worldview. In Ulysses, James Joyce wrote, art has to reveal to us ideas, formless spiritual essences. The supreme question about a work of art is out of how deep a life does it spring. All the rest is speculation of schoolboys for schoolboys. Jean-Michel Basquiat's life was short, and his career as an artist only 10 years. It is amazing that this young man made the important contributions to 20th century art that he did. Even more impressive was his awareness and sophisticated interpretation of his world. He must have been aware of his unique gift long before he began his practice as an artist. By the time of his first one-person exhibition, the depth of his insight was apparent. His themes had profound meaning, were rendered with a mature artist's recognition of traditions and techniques that had gone before him. Basquiat leapt forth with a totally new voice. Like the spiritual masters, Basquiat seemed to possess an understanding of fundamental truths. He must be recognized as a painter equal to Picasso, Pollock, and Rauschenberg, but also as a visionary, able to touch our innermost souls. Thank you.
Do you know what year
Sorry.
Masonic Lodge was painted?
It was painted in 1982.
Okay, thank you.
Late 1982.
Have you looked at other areas of his work in as much depth as
Well, you know what got me started, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I worked with Jean-Michel Basquiat and was very close to him for a period of his life, short life. And after he died, I mean, I was involved with his post his life, his career, selling his work, arranging for some shows of his work. And then in 2005, when I was asked by the Brooklyn Museum to curate the last American retrospective, I was very eager to do that, but I was also a little bit daunted because I had basically taken off my art hat as an art historian 25 years before that and hadn't done any major I curate shows by having an art gallery, but I hadn't written anything extensively on Basquiat. So when I thought about what I wanted to write for the catalog for the Brooklyn MoCA exhibition, I primarily focused on this work of art. And it was, even though I knew the work quite well, it's owned by the Broad Foundation in Los Angeles, and I've been close to the Broad family and the museum, et cetera, and know the work quite well. Until I actually sat down to write, I didn't realize how profound the work was. In fact, I was the one that caused the work to be renamed Untitled, and it had been called Untitled Skull for 30-some years. But I have, in the course of writing this more recent book, taken on some other subjects, I would say with the same degree of depth. I've written on I guess, the subject of the image of the black male in black identity in my recent book. I've written a lot on Basquiat's works on paper and drawing extensively. In terms of, there's a whole range of different kinds of works on paper that he made. And then the late paintings, which for many, many, many years were completely overlooked and sort of dished as, oh, it's like, you know, an afterthought and a real letdown, and Basquiat only had 2 good years, and I just refused to, you know, buy into any of that. Given his talent and how much a genius he was, and so I started investigating his late works. And I've written a lot on the late works lately. I've written a lot on the late works, which was even more into the subject of the duality of flesh and spirit.
Right here, Fred. It seems to be a reoccurring theme to have either the word crowned or an image of a crown in a lot of his portraits. In the Masonic Lodge, he writes the word crown, but in a lot of portraits you showed earlier, he had the image of a crown on top of a lot of the portraits' heads.
Right.
Could you speak to the significance of that?
Well, yeah, like in the work back of the neck, which we saw early on, there was a spinal column and the crown at the top. So it would be, you know, referencing transcendence and illumination, sort of, you know, going from the realm of flesh into the realm of spirit. And then I would say it symbolizes transcendence, to keep it simple. And, you know, I mean, Basquiat loved to play with symbols and icons, and that, you know, he was, you know, like attention too. So, I mean, it became pretty clear that it was sort of a cool image, even in his own time. I mean, it's taken on, you know, it's become part of popular culture now. I mean, you find it in countless references, whether it's in clothing lines or even, you know, in other people's, in music. I mean, you could write a whole study on the image of Basquiat's crown and how it's been proliferated into other forms of popular culture. But I would say, generally speaking, it's about illumination, it's about identity, it's about a greater sense of self.
I've never thought about or associated Basquiat in my mind with surrealist practice. But this painting on the right, for some reason,
I think that's a good point.
Surrealist.
Well, I think there's
both in relationship to not the look of Basquiat, but certainly the look and procedure, with the content of things, but the look and procedure of Pierrot, and particularly the kind of pictorial fields and signs, simple fields.
I think it's a very good point. I've never actually gone into that, but I think it's a very good point. I mean, Basquiat was astutely aware of virtually everything. I've never thought of Basquiat being particularly attracted to Miro, but I think your point about sort of this fragmentation of disparate parts filling the field of a canvas is a good point. But even more so, I think the surrealist practice in poetry and in writing directly relates to this work. Indirectly, Basquiat's coming to that through some of the later followers of surrealist literary practice, such as the Beats, such as William Bruce, who he was close to, and Brian Geisen for sure. And the idea of taking a text and cutting it up and then, you know, rearranging it. I mean, I think in the fragmentation I mean, fragmentation is definitely part of his surrealist aesthetic, no question.
Also, just I'm reminded that it is the early 1980s when those mural paintings of the mid-20s were actually begun to be discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't, I mean, Basquiat, went to museums regularly. I mean, his mother had him in the Museum of Art when he was, a young teenager. But for me, what Basquiat was particularly attracted to going to the modern was Picasso. And then he was clearly attracted to the sub-Saharan African and Oceanic collections at the Met, where in my book, I have identified specific works that influence some of his paintings, especially for the image of the heroic black male figure.
I was just wondering if you could recall like a conversation with him about consciousness.
No,
No.
which I think is good, actually. I've thought about that a lot. No, I never had that kind of conversation with him. But I think intuitively we were on the same page in a lot of ways. I spent a lot of time with him, but there weren't heady conversations. I mean, I think he understood that was a particular interest of mine, and I think I was drawn to him because I could see that was in his work. I mean, back then I was just sort of overwhelmed by, I mean, he was sort of a bigger-than-life kind of person to be around. I mean, he's such energy and magnetism. So, but I never remember talking to him specifically about consciousness. I've never had any doubts about some of my conclusions about what I've written about him and the theme of consciousness. I think some people are sort of resistant to embracing it as thoroughly as I have. And I think they're coming from also different cultural and social backgrounds, and they might be more attracted to other themes in Basquiat. But I do think it's one of the central themes for his vision. Sure.
Kind of off of that a little bit, I was wondering, maybe, do you recall the first moment that you met him, or really...
Do I have what?
Recall the first moment that you met him, or really an extraordinary moment? I know you shared those photos.
Well, you might. I'll tell a little story to you. But you should go to my website and read. There's the introduction to my book. I talk about it a lot. Some of the. I mean, I think the first time I met him, I was invited to come meet him in the studio, and it was a little formal. I mean, it was two people coming from a pretty different place, and he, it's like no messing around. So within like 10 or 15 minutes, he started showing to me what I don't know if this thing will, if I keep going forward, will it go, no, it has to go all the way back. So I guess we can get back there, but, oh, one miss. Okay, so I was brought to meet Jean-Michel with the idea of making this work tuxedo. So this is a silkscreen work, and as you can see, it's sort of like a grid kind of structure. So there's, you can look and you could count if you want. Each of these sections would have been a work on paper that would have been the positive. It would have been black oil paint stick on a white ground. And I came into the studio and Jean-Michel laid this whole thing out on the ground. So it laid out on the ground. This piece in the tuxedo is 101 inches tall. If you laid out all the original artwork, it's like 130 inches. It's like close to 12 feet tall and 6 feet wide. So he laid it out. He said, I'd like to turn this into a silkscreen, reversing the entire piece. Okay, I immediately said, I got it. But working out the details to make it was very complicated. So my first encounter with him was about how to, do I feel comfortable and does he feel comfortable? So it was that kind of thing. And then from that, there was a lot of follow-up to going from seeing this in the positive form to getting it made, which meant that I was in the studio on a daily basis. So, you just warm up to and start, one thing leads to the next. I lived in Venice about 8 blocks from where he had a studio, and I would go over often after dinner and watch him work. And I would just sit on that mattress for 5 or 6 hours. Well, I would basically go and end up falling asleep, and then I'd wake up at 5 in the morning and he was gone. And I watched, and he did lots of amazing things as he made his paintings that I was pretty mystified by. My wife always wants me to tell the story that, which I start my book with out of respect to her, but I don't think it's super important. But when Basquiat was first out in Los Angeles, he was actually dating Madonna, and Madonna came out and stayed with him in the studio. And it's a great story. And so one day they asked me, or Larry Gagosian asked me, I forgot, but somehow it was decided that I would take them to the commissary at 20th Century Fox for lunch. So the commissary at 20th Century Fox is a gigantic dining room that has a main floor and then these raised dais areas where sort of the seniors and the execs were. And so there were already some big Hollywood people collecting Basquiat right from the get-go. And so one of them arranged for us to get a table, and I took them up to the commissary. And I remember in the commissary, we had a little enclosed area that had 2 seats and then 2 seats. So they sat in the front, and I sat in the row behind them, right behind them. And I just sort of watched them, deal with all of Hollywood did this. And they, these are both 21-year-olds, and they looked at each other and then sort of scowled out at the audience. I think it was more Madonna it was definitely more Madonna than Jean-Michel, because he was always more reserved and polite. And she looked out, and I recall her pointing, but I don't want to swear to that, and say someday everybody in this room is going to know who I am, or we are. And I've never forgotten that. So it's a lot of confidence.
Over the weekend, I was actually in New York, and I went to the
Oh,
Brand
good.
Foundation.
Lucky you.
Where they had 4 floors
Right.
of his work. And one of them that really stood out to me, it had nails in it, a lot of nails between the panels, and even one that it could be hair or a crown. And I just had never seen that really in his work.
It's in a separate room on the ground floor in the back. It's a multi-panel. It's got 2 king kind of figures with. Yeah, it's a great painting.
And I didn't remember. I feel like it was 1982, but I wasn't.
When it was made?
Or
No, it was later actually. It was made in 1985.
And I was wondering if you thought that he would have experimented more with that and objects coming out of the paintings.
Do you think? Do I think that he did or would have?
Even more so.
I mean, if he had lived longer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, I mean that painting. You had a painting on view here a year ago called Flexible, which is one of the first paintings that was done on wood slats. It came actually from a fence behind his studio that we took down the fence and brought it in the studio, and then he turned it around and turned it into a picture support. And that got him going with using wood supports, which is, Basquiat came from the streets and was always responsive to life on the street. So bringing materials in from the street was obviously an important part of his practice. And so that piece, which is called Griot, is one of the crowning achievements of that. And then it has all these nails punched in, hammered into it, which is sort of a reference with, fetishism and his interest in non-Western cultures. The 2 figures are clearly both kings. I can't remember. I don't really want to go into great detail on the painting, but there's a lot of interesting references in that painting. Yeah, that I think would have played out in other work.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Just to speak a bit more about how his life influenced his art. This is quite.
how his life influences art.
Well,
Oh, yeah.
I was
The
saw the
simplest-
Barbican exhibit in London.
The what?
The
Oh,
Barbican
oh, sure.
exhibit in 2017.
Oh, great, yeah.
And there was so much about the downtown scene
Right, yeah.
in New York in that instance. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how the scene in Venice Beach was influencing the work during that time.
No. I think,
Or not.
No, not. So Basquiat had already started to have a significant, he had a following in New York. And there was a lot of hype around Basquiat because this is a fast-growing art world in the early 80s in New York. There was a whole new culture. It was sort of a revival of interest in painting, the confluence of art and music and dance and all kinds of culture coming together in Lower Manhattan. And Basquiat was clearly an important part of that. And that clearly had a major, and given that Basquiat left home at the age of 15, was living in this milieu for 4 or 5 years without, from just, crashing at one place to another. I mean, his whole, combined with his own innate focus on observation. I've always said that observation was the key defining aspect of, besides his intuition, his ability to observe, take in, and then put back out. Anyway, so after even 3 or 4 shows, one in New York, there started to be a lot of pressure on Basquiat. What's he going to do and how? And the parts of the New York art world were really cruel to Basquiat back then. I mean, his early shows got horrible reception from the critics. Some of the major American or world critics, Robert Hughes and Hilton Kramer, completely dished and panned Basquiat. They were really abusive. And that's being kind. And the Museum of Modern Art was completely put off. To say, not on my watch. So in a way, Los Angeles, and there's a lot of pressure. He's 21 years old. There's a lot of pressure on this young man. And coming to Los Angeles was sort of a relief valve in a place where he could work and basically be left alone. And I think, and just be a 21-year-old. I mean, when Basquiat wasn't working, he was out in the clubs in LA just having the time of his life. It was really easy. There was not a lot of distraction. He was living in Venice, and there was a whole artistic milieu of Venice. And there was a restaurant that we all hung out in Venice that I did exhibitions. I actually did a Basquiat show there called the West Beach Cafe. And Basquiat was a regular visitor to that and knew all the Venice artists, but he never became friends with any of them.
Well, how long was he there? What's the time span of that period in Venice?
From November 1982, and then he was around for like 8 months, and then he left for a few months and then came back, and we got him another studio where he kept until about May or June of 1984.
I'm afraid our time is up. So please join me. Thank you again, Fred.
My pleasure.